is Christian Gomez with the New American Magazine, and today I'm joined with Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky. Congressman Massie, thank you again for being with us here on the program.
Thanks for having me on, Christian.
So, about a week ago's time from recording, you had an exchange with Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg with regard to President Biden's recent declaration or executive order stating his desire, at least, to have 50% of all vehicles manufactured in the U.S. by the year 2030 to have them be electrical. Now, in your estimation, Congressman, is that even a feasible goal, even for those who are environmentalists and they want to reduce emissions and so forth? Is that even an attainable goal by 2030, 50% of all manufactured vehicles in the U.S.?
Well, I don't think it's attainable. But if it were, it would have massive consequences for the electrical grid. He also has another policy, Biden does, and Buttigieg has endorsed it, to make the entire federal fleet electric by 2035. So you take those two things and combine them, and it will have a massive impact on the grid. And so I tried to relate that to our Secretary of Transportation by asking him, for instance, which uses more electricity, a refrigerator or an electric car when it's charging? And he rightly guessed electric car, but then I also asked him, do you know how much? It takes 25 times as much over the course of a year to charge your electric car as it would to run your refrigerator. So putting that in equivalent terms for people, can you imagine the impact on the grid if every household had 25 refrigerators running? It would be insane. And the other way that I related the impact of Biden's goal is to relate it to air conditioning. The average American spends 17% of their electric on air conditioning, or uses 17% of their electric bill goes to air conditioning. And if they were to adopt Biden's policy, if they were to go 100% electric car, they would use 4 times as much for their electric car as they do for all of their air conditioning over the course of a year. Now, if they get to Biden's goal, which is 50% by 2030, that means that households would be using twice as much to charge their electric car as to run their air conditioning. And that's the one thing in the summer that some states like Texas have had problems with. The problem is in the daytime when the air conditioners kick on. And it's also hot at night too, but you see blackouts and brownouts. And Secretary Buttigieg said, oh, well, we need to be ready for it by then. And I'm like, that's not what I asked. I asked, are we going to be ready? I don't care about the needs and the wants and the hopes. I want to know about engineering, not political science.
Do you think that the administration is being incompetent, considering the likely consequences with potential blackouts in the future in 2030 onwards? Or do you think there's a bit of an intentional motive here on the part of the administration?
Well, they're being unrealistic. And if you were to ask me what their intent is or what the outcome of this is going to be, I think it might be the same. And that is, everybody's going to have a lower standard of living. CNN published a piece 3 days after I interviewed Buttigieg saying that Americans don't need air conditioning, that they're spoiled, and that most Europeans don't have air conditioning, so we could, adopt the European model. Look, they want you to do less and be happy because of it. But the problem is people will die. I mean, for elderly people in the South, air conditioning is a form of life support, frankly, in some states.
Well, it's interesting that you said that you'll be happy. It reminds me of the World Economic Forum and the video they put out about the Great Reset, where they say in their own video that by the year 2030, they're listing all the various goals that they want to achieve. And one of them is you will own nothing, no private property. And you mentioned as well, they want to get you into using mass transportation, getting you to live in the cities, basically have you be a renter in an urban area. And they say you will own nothing and you will be happy. And then they have the smiling face of the young man and his nice glistening teeth who doesn't even own a toothbrush because he owns nothing. yet he's happy. So this is what the Biden administration is doing. They're taking us on the path to achieve the goals, at least so it seems, of the world that the World Economic Forum has set out. A lot of this actually looks like it's stemming from the United Nations. Like the Biden administration is trying to meet the objectives of either the Paris Agreement or the Agenda 2030 UN goals, which is all over the UN website. What would be, Congressman, the most effective way to stop this pursuit of Agenda 2030 and sustainable development, the goals of the United Nations that we currently see the administration bowing down to in pursuing in almost every major policy decision that they're making?
Well, Congress needs to defund all of this nonsense, like the ESG scores. Just put these as riders. You know, you've got the Hyde Amendment that prevents the government from funding abortion. Put the same sort of riders in every appropriations bill. You cannot fund this global agenda, and Republicans need to do that when we get in power. It won't shut the government down. It will just say we're not bowing down to another government.
Now, you said that we need to start defunding all of these radical policy objectives that the administration is pursuing, but you're also co-sponsoring a bill in Congress to get us out of the United Nations, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, which would, according to the first line of the bill, more or less, it states that it would repeal the United Nations Participation Act of 1945 to terminate our membership in the UN and all of the UN affiliates that there are. Why is it important that Congress pass this bill? Even if the president vetoes this bill, why should Congress pursue getting us out of the UN?
Well, we need to push back. We don't need to be part of an organization of despots and dictators that push communism and socialism and, like we were saying, lower standards of living for Americans. Just get the heck out of this organization. We would save money in the process. And it's important for us to pass it so that if we ever get a president who has the guts to sign it, we already have members of Congress on record. You need to know where your member of Congress stands.
Absolutely. And of course, you know, you mentioned communism and socialism, and many of these various UN leaders are representatives of governments that have impoverished their people, that have intentionally put policies in place that have reduced the standard of living. So here we have a global bureaucracy of people who are reducing their own citizens' standard of living in their home countries, trying to dictate to us here in America how our emission rates should be and so forth. So it really says a lot when we have a president who is more beholden to the United Nations and its objectives, even using the UN's own slogan, Build Back Better, and co-opting it or plagiarizing it, which wouldn't be a first for our current president, for himself. Now, with regards to the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals of reducing emissions, they've talked a lot about reducing emissions from even nitrogen, fertilizers and things of that nature. And if they want 50% of all the vehicles we were talking about earlier manufactured in the U.S. to be electrical, what would that do to, say, the agricultural industry and farming, where a lot of diesel, well, most of the equipment that's required is almost all diesel in that area? What do Biden's mandates mean for the ag industry and the mom and pop farmers?
Well, you know, I farm myself, and I cut and roll my own hay for my cattle. I raise cattle. The biggest input, the biggest expense on my farm, after you acquire the equipment, the biggest ongoing expense is actually the diesel fuel. It's a huge input into farming. It's also a huge input into transporting those farm goods or the materials that come to the farms. That's why it's more inelastic than the price of gas. You can see the price of gas go up and down as people decide not to go on vacation or to stay home or to carpool, but you can't like carpool, cattle or whatever. They're already carpooled, truck pulled. You can't save, you can't economize on that when it comes to industry, and particularly the ag industry when the price goes up. So, the result is, Christian, you're going to have less selection in the supermarket. You're going to have shortages. It won't be necessarily that you can't buy protein at the supermarket, but you'll go to the supermarket and you can't buy, for instance, pork or beef, and you'll have to settle for tofu and chicken and peanut butter or something. It will look like Soviet Russia. there'll be lines too. You'll be rationed.
And this is on top of the current inflation that we're seeing with grocery prices.
Absolutely. That's one of the things I look for them to do, is to ration as a way to avoid the inflationary effects when you have a limited supply.
Do you think it's possible for the ag industry and for farmers to move from diesel to electric equipment and vehicles?
That is not possible. The amount of torque and power that's required, and you also don't have the luxury of only farming when there's no clouds above. There's certain things that must go on. So it's totally unrealistic, especially within that industry. You'll have shortages and you'll have rationing, and you're already starting to see some of that. Look, over the course of the last 100 years, the trend for ag in the United States is actually to use less acreage and to be more efficient with it by using equipment that's powered with diesel and by using fertilizer. We will have to go back. If you're going to get less yield per acre, you're going to have more acres in usage. It's just not practical.
And of course, with the current administration pursuing its 30 by 30 goal of having 30%, I believe it is 30% of all land in the U.S. be federalized by the year 2030, if more land is taken from the ag industry and they're putting restrictions or making it harder for farmers to get diesel vehicles, are we going to see even more than just even shortages? Could we even see famine in America? Is that something that's possible, where it's engineered by the government's own policies?
I think you'll just see a lower quality of living. I think there's still a way for people not to starve. I mean, in this country, obesity is still a condition of poverty. Like the bad calories, basically. You'll get more of the bad calories and less of the good calories. Another threat, Christian, to our food supply in this country is the centralization of it. Because of overregulation from the government, you have fewer farmers making more food each, and even fewer processors who can get that from the farm to the supermarket. And now that we have fewer processors, a lot of them are international. You've even heard Biden say at the State of the Union that 4 meat processors control 80% of the market. What he doesn't also tell you is one of those is wholly owned by China, and the other is wholly owned by Brazil. It's just amazing to me. And they shut down during COVID. Also, they have choices. China can decide how much of our pork do they want to export to China and how much do they want to sell domestically if they start controlling those markets. So there are all sorts of threats that are driven by the federal government, either through trying to ration fertilizer and land through government policies, or through adopting overregulation that causes a consolidation in the industry and allowing China to come in and buy these providers and also to buy the land.
Speaking of assaults on our freedoms that we're seeing, some of your colleagues have introduced a resolution called House Concurrent Resolution 101, officially titled Calling an Article 5 Convention for Proposing Amendments to the Constitution of the United States and stipulating the ratification of such amendments by state conventions, a vote of we the people, and for other purposes. Essentially, a resolution calling for a constitutional convention. Now, according to Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, 2/3 of the states have to apply to Congress for then Congress to call it, which would mean 34. There have to be 34 active applications. There are not currently 34 active applications, nor have there been 34 active applications for either the Balanced Budget Amendment or the Wolf Pack for the campaign finance reform, or even for the Mark Meckler's Convention of States efforts. There is no 34 under any of those tallies or any other tallies, but the resolution calls, for, generally speaking, for a convention for proposing amendments, doesn't place any limitations on it, and it's been introduced by Congressman Jody Arrington. Now, what are your thoughts about this bill that's being introduced right now, especially at a time when Republicans are in the minority?
Well, I think it's a horrible idea. And, there's a way that Congress can be involved in amending the Constitution. We we propose that, we debate it, and we pass those in the House, and then it's up to the states to ratify. That's the only way that the Constitution has been amended since the beginning of the country. And I think what they're proposing is a different path. Ironically, Congress would not be involved in the solution they're proposing. So I don't know why you would come to Congress and then suggest that you shouldn't be part of the solution. Maybe they should be in their states organizing those conventions instead of Congress, because it's an alternate path. I think it's a bad idea. Number one, a lot of our colleagues don't follow the Constitution we have. I don't think they'll follow a new one or a newly amended one that comes out of that process if they're not following the one we have now. But the other thing to think about is, since the 11th Amendment to the Constitution, at least 3/4, probably more like 90% of the amendments have expanded the power of the federal government. They don't contract it. And so I think it's a really dangerous process. When you look at polls, like on the Second Amendment or things of the day, a lot of times the public sentiment at the moment is wrong and it's counter to the Constitution. So I would not change it in this political environment.
And of course, when you look at, you mentioned before how all of the previous amendments of the Constitution, they came out of Congress. Even the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, they all came out of Congress proposing them initially, and then the states afterwards ratified them. But in all of those cases, you knew exactly what you were getting. You had the text of the amendments coming out of Congress that you could review, that the states themselves could review and debate back and forth. When it comes to this convention, we don't know what we would get out of it, correct?
Correct. I mean, there are a lot of people who think you can play with the fire and not get burned. It comes down to the integrity of the people that are chosen to do that process. And look, the integrity of our founding fathers was impeccable. They were willing to die to be able to contribute to the document, our founding documents. And the ones now will probably be the ones who get the most money from George Soros or somebody. They'll rise to the top, and the contests that will determine who gets to control that convention will not be good. It will be a Pandora's box, and the type of people who rise to the top in those kind of contests are not the type of people who rose to the top in the beginning of our country.
Congressman Massie, thank you so much again for your time, and we always appreciate your insights on what's going on there in Washington and your perspective, which is always one that reflects the Constitution and the principles of liberty. So, Congressman, keep up the great work. Thank you so much, and God bless you.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you for the mission that you guys have undertaken to educate the population on what's really happening here in Congress.
Thank you so much.